Who was behind the 9/11 attacks? They gave Washington a reason to try to dominate the Mideast and plunder its oil wealth.
The CIA has a covert army in Afghanistan and Pakistan. What do we know about this army? How big is it, Chris?
Well, if you're talking about the fact that the CIA has literally built a local army, it is a 3,000-man paramilitary force, all local Afghans, and it's called the Counterterrorism Pursuit Teams. A U.S. official describes them to us as elite forces, saying, quote, "These are some of the finest Afghan fighting forces. They made a major contribution to security there." A Pentagon source says there is a level of cooperation between these units and U.S. military forces in that area. He says, at a minimum, knowing what units are doing when and where so you don't have friendly fire mistakes. Now, a former senior intelligence official says these units were formed about 8 years ago, initially focusing on Afghanistan. He said the CIA was recruiting people who could blend into Afghan society and do clandestine missions, but they eventually started doing missions over the border in Pakistan. He said that area is very tribal, and Afghans can easily cross back and forth over the border into Pakistan.
President Obama saying today that all options are on the table in dealing with Iran. Iran currently under 4 sets of UN sanctions, in fact, for refusing to stop enriching uranium and rejecting other UN demands. Uncooperative for sure, but just how dangerous are they? Or is it really just a distraction from the real issue? U.S.-Saudi relations and the percolating religious war that has been there for decades between Israel and their Arab neighbors. Iran in context of the underlying issues of the Middle East. Is it a problem? Should we be going to war with them? Are they going to nuke us? Or is it simply a distraction from actually much bigger issues?
Well, I think what you see is that every time Ahmadinejad comes to the United States, you have the same repetitious dance that benefits extremists in both countries. You have the faction in the United States that wants the Americans to be in conflict with Iran, to go to war with Iran, that seizes on Ahmadinejad's crazy inflammatory statements, while Ahmadinejad benefits politically at home when the entire world, when the Iranians perceive that the entire world is
Ahmadinejad wins to appearing to be standing up to America.
And the extremists in America win by doing what they did in the run-up to the Iraq War, which is ratcheting up the fear levels and saying, look at this bad man in the Muslim world pursuing nuclear weapons, we have to go to war with
them. Do you not then also get to avoid the reality of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia and how dysfunctional that spreads throughout the totality of the Middle East? We all know where the 9/11 hijackers come from. We all saw the most recent arms deal, et cetera, or for that matter, from the Israeli-Arab relationship. And allowing us to go to war with Iran lets us avoid the real problems, no?
Well, those are the two hypocrisies that the rest of the world realizes that the American population often doesn't, which is we pretend that we're concerned about Iran's internal policies towards their people, and yet our best friends in the Muslim world, including the Saudis and the Egyptians and many others, are infinitely worse in terms of their tyrannical behavior. And then, of course, Israel is always at the center of all of this, because while we, lecture the Muslim world that they cannot get nuclear weapons, that Iran cannot get nuclear weapons, we protect Israel that has a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, that refuses to submit to any inspections, to be a part of the NPT, and the entire Muslim world sees that we enable Israel's nuclear weapons while pretending to be so concerned about nuclear weapons in general. So just look at the facts as far as who the aggressive powers are here. What you can pick up a newspaper every day and see Israel threatening to bomb Iran. You can see newspapers every day advocating that the United States bomb Iran. Iran looks to the east and the west and sees the American military occupying 2 countries on either side of it.
We invaded the countries on either side of them for no apparent reason in the case of Iraq. If somebody invaded Canada and North America, in Mexico, I imagine the U.S. would fund the insurgency to get the invaders in Canada out, which is, I'm sure, how America's perceived in Iraq.
And it's almost impossible to count the wars that the United States and Israel have started over the last decade. You have to go back many, many decades, centuries, to find a time when Iran invaded another country or started a war. And so this warmongering that takes place is all based on the same kind of fear-mongering that led us into the disaster of Iraq, and they want to repeat that in Iran now.
And isn't Iran just a distraction from the Israeli relationship with the Arabs and the American relationship with its allies in the Middle East? So we point to our enemies to avoid the obvious. I mean, that's real. That's my question. Did Iraq require military force? In retrospect, who's to decide what's required? In other words, I take issue with the suggestion that some hand of God to decide what's when military force is required when we've just blown. Do we have the graphic of all the dead people that in Iraq from American bullets for a war that was apparently required until we found out it wasn't? When you say deal with the problem, so if we're going to ignore U.S. Saudi, we're going to ignore Arab Israeli. Should we just go kill all the Iranians? I mean, let's fire this thing up. What's the plan?
I'm not as anti-American as you apparently are.
No.
If you think the problems in Iraq
you're maybe the most anti-American guest I've ever had, Cliff, because your willingness to portray America out of context in a way that proceeds to advance the interest of your desire to create conflict in Iran could not be more anti-American. In fact, I consider myself to be the most patriotic person sitting at this table insofar as at least I'm willing to try to address the reality of America's relationships in the Middle East, who we fund, what they do with the guns that we sell to them, how they treat their women, instead of pretending that some other person whose name I can't pretend wants to kill me for the past 30 years when Iran hasn't expressed a single threat against America or the West outside of Israel, as far as I can tell, since the beginning. You also have to be honest about the sequence of events. In other words, if we say, well, Iran funded the Sunnis, but we ignore the fact that America invaded Iraq for no reason while Israel has nuclear weapons. In other words, I'm not trying to be difficult, but can't you kind of pick whatever you want? If you eliminate the fact that the CIA paid for this and that we give them money for that and the Russians did this, and then you act, oh my goodness, look at these terrible people. Well, out of context, maybe, but in context, you kind of like, what concerns me is the use of my tax money to fund American soldiers and American weapons that are used by Middle Eastern powers that use that power to subordinate other Middle Easterners who are much poorer that others we would claim to defend in one country, and we're happy to give the guns to the king in another country so we can do the same thing. And the hypocrisy, I believe, is at the root of this problem in the Middle East,
Hypocrisy and American belligerence is the root. That's your view, and that's Glenn's view. I got it now.
I didn't say that. I said hypocrisy across the board, not just American belligerence. I said hypocrisy, period, in the American relationship, in the Israeli relationship, in the Iranian relationship, period. And if America can't admit its own hypocrisy and its own bankroll in funding that hypocrisy, it is impossible, I believe, for us to actually solve this problem.
Pakistan's spy agency is still in cahoots with the Taliban. A new White House report, as we've said, a report to Congress this week, criticized Pakistan's military for not doing enough to take on the Taliban. And today's Wall Street Journal alleging far worse, that the Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, is actively encouraging the Taliban to keep up the fight.
Let's not forget, ISI essentially created the Taliban, armed them, funded them, encouraged them, trained them to take over Pakistan from what later became known as the Northern Alliance after the Soviets were defeated. So the fact that they're still aiding the Taliban...
You mean Afghanistan?
Right.
Yeah.
The fact that they're still aiding the Taliban doesn't surprise me. It outrages me, but it doesn't surprise me. Elements of the ISI have been funding and arming and equipping the Taliban right on through.
Well, that may very well be, but we're continuing to lose, dozens of American troops. And if the ISI is working against us in Afghanistan, and maybe if it isn't new, it's still nonetheless occurring and not showing forward progress in a war, and we're losing people all the time.
A number of private security firms hired by the US military in Afghanistan have links to the Taliban. A report released by a congressional committee says the Defense Department is overly reliant on the services of Afghan warlords, some of them diverting US funds to criminal activities and to armed opponents of the NATO-led coalition.
With the war on terror now entering its 10th year, we're getting now some disturbing news about who is guarding some US bases in Afghanistan. This is all according to this new report. This is from the Senate Armed Services Committee. Tribal warlords with ties to the Taliban were paid with American tax dollars to act as guards. The Pentagon catching heat for this, obviously. Senators say the lack of oversight for security contractors has put U.S. troops at grave risk.
Security contracting in Afghanistan comes off as some sort of gangster movie in this scathing Senate report. One example, Armor Group hired a series of warlords to guard an airbase and gave them code names to hide their identity.
So this is the company's naming of these warlords: Mr. Pink, Mr. White, Mr. White II. Those warlords were variously implicated in murder and bribery, As a matter of fact, Mr. Pink killed Mr. White 1.
The Pentagon contracts with security companies, which then pay Afghans to guard bases or supply convoys. What did this group buy with American taxpayer dollars?
They were found to possess landmines and large amounts of ammunition, and were determined by the U.S. military to be in league with the Taliban.
In fact, the report says Mr. White number 2 was holding a Taliban meeting in his home when U.S. and Afghan troops raided it. The Armed Services Committee investigated 125 contracts like this and found the Pentagon didn't have the manpower to oversee its own contracts.
In another case, even more serious, this one just back in February, security guards shot at American troops. The troops who were being shot at started yelling out, "We're Marines, we're Marines." They kept shooting, and one security guard shot and killed a U.S. Marine. It gets worse from there, because when they were detained, when the military detained these guards, they found out not only were they high on opium, they hadn't even been trained how to use their rifle, bro. Wow.
The CIA stepping up its use of Predator drones, launching 20 attacks in September alone. That is the most we have ever launched as a country in a single month. While the Pakistani government is protesting a rare NATO attack inside its own territory, helicopters crossing the border from Afghanistan and killing more than 70 militants over the weekend under pilot, not again robotically. General David Petraeus has hinted at a widening war, one that could include ground operations in Pakistan's tribal regions. One wonders, as the statistics from manned aircraft to the explosion in Predator drone activity, whether we're approaching the tipping point when it comes to Pakistan.
During the Obama administration, the use of Predator drones being 4 times what we saw under the Bush administration. These recent reports of helicopter attacks taking place. Bob Woodward's book recently coming out talking about the CIA running 3,000-man private units into Pakistan. Based upon all of these allegations or reports, however you want to see it, it seems that we are starting to expand these operations, not just throughout Afghanistan, but actually into Pakistan itself.
And the implications of that?
Well, I think at the end, it sounds like the old line, we're going to fight them there so we don't fight them here. I mean, it's somewhat ridiculous. Unfortunately, I think this is how it's playing out. In the short term, it's designed to actually limit the capability of the Taliban. The problem is it exacerbates the feelings in the region, which may make it even more dangerous down the road, not just in the Northwest provinces, but throughout the Muslim world, if this is seen as an attack that's much broader than just the bad guys.
If you were to look at the drone strikes, and I don't know if we can get, we have a chart in terms of the acceleration of those drone strikes compared to under the Bush administration. It is a startling explosion in the use of the Predator drones. Is there a way for those who feel there must be a better way, there must be a different way, there must be a less inflammatory, less sort of yippee-ki-yay, sort of bad boy gratifying way to deal with this than what we've got? Is there a way to exert a counter voice of some kind?
You know, Dylan, it's a great question. Here's the problem. If you take a look at what the Republicans are saying right now and what the Democrats are saying, it's almost the exact same thing. In the leadership on both sides of the House and the Senate and at the White House, what you're getting is more people pounding their chest, talking about what it is that we're capable of doing. Look, I've been on the ground in Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, around the country, and what I can tell you is regardless of whether we're operating in Afghanistan or in parts of the Northwest provinces, this is going to be an incredibly difficult situation. My guess at the end of the day is that this is not going to turn out well, and we're going to find a new kind of mission accomplished banner that we put up, and then we all go home and say we won. And remember, the focus is saying that we won.
Right. Last question for you. Are we making America safer for our children?
No. We are not. We're actually making it probably more difficult. We're alienating a large base of the Middle East. And remember, at least 1.5 billion Muslims. When we make mistakes like this, it makes it worse down the road, even if we think we're making ourselves safer now.
Your tax dollars are being funneled to Afghan warlords and strongmen linked to murder, kidnapping, and bribery.
No doubt about that. Well, do you believe spending cuts need to include the military as well? And if so, won't that be in direct conflict with the GOP agenda for resisting cuts to the armed forces?
Yes, I guess some are deeply indebted to the military-industrial complex, but I'm sort of from the Eisenhower era, where he and others warned about the military-industrial complex. I want a strong national defense, And if you waste money bombing places and then rebuilding them while our old country's falling down and our borders aren't protected, it's not going to work. So I think a growing number of not only Republicans, but a growing number of independents and Tea Party people realize that you can't say, oh, well, this cut spending for food stamps, but not for the military-industrial complex. That won't work. And I think that is really going to be the test.